preventing pests from overrunning our facilities. Exporters react to the ongoing tariffs saga. And new developments for forklifts in California. Pull up a chair and join us as the editors of DC Velocity discuss these stories as well as news and supply chain trends on this week's Logistics Matters podcast. Hi, I'm Dave Maloney. I'm the Group Editorial Director at DC Velocity. Welcome. Logistics Matters is sponsored by Storage Solutions. Storage Solutions, a Young Heinrich company, is a leading intralogistics integrator, helping companies design scalable, tailored solutions. From warehouse consultations to racking and automation solutions, they deliver proven, reliable technologies built to support your operations now and scale as you grow. To learn more, visit storage-solutions.com. As usual, our DC Velocity senior editors Ben Ames and Victoria Kickham will be along to provide their insights into the top stories of this week. But to begin today, it's a subject that few people want to talk about, except maybe for our guest today. I'm talking about the pests that often overrun our facilities. We're talking mice, rats, bugs, and other critters that get in and destroy products, contaminate areas, and just cause a general nuisance. I recently spoke with our guest, Ian Williams. He's the Technical Services Manager at Orkin, about the problem of pests. And he has some great ideas on how to keep them out of our buildings, and if they get in, to deal with them for good. Here's our conversation. Welcome, Ian. It's good to have you with us today on Logistics Matters.
David, thanks so much. I'm excited to be here with you all.
For those who are not familiar with Orkin, can you share a bit about your company?
Yeah, Orkin is one of the nation's largest, and we've got international operations as well, but pest control companies. We're founded in 1901, and we service, commercial facilities, homes, businesses, everywhere in between, as an essential service to try and make sure that we're protecting our customers' properties and making sure that pests are not invading their facilities.
And that is a problem, obviously. It's not everybody's favorite problem to have to deal with, but there are pests that do get into manufacturing, distribution, and transportation facilities. How serious of a problem is it?
It ranges. It ranges a little bit on the type of product that's being moved around, but especially when you get into kind of the wide berth of logistics, you can have very sensitive materials in there, foods, pharmaceuticals that can be contaminated and potentially destroyed by pests. You can have some things that maybe are tarnished and it just becomes a lost product or a damaged product from an aesthetic standpoint with pests. But it's definitely something that anybody who's in the logistics space should be concerned of, because pests can move to some extent on their own, but are often inadvertently moved by us while we're moving all these other products and equipment and materials around.
What type of pests are most troublesome and most prevalent in facilities?
A lot of times what we get to deal with certainly can be rodents that get moved around. So typically we're talking about Norway rats, roof rats, or house mice. Those are the big three kind of commensal rodents that love to be in and around human development and readily take advantage of an area like a logistics facility and can survive, moving inside of pallets of dog food or grass seed or you name it. If it's edible, they can probably survive on it. But that's one of the big ones, because once they get into a facility, oftentimes warehouses are huge in the hundreds, if not millions, of square feet. And tracking down an animal that can think and learn through its environments can be very challenging. The other insect side of what we deal with a lot would be potentially stored product pests that get moved in. A shipment gets contaminated and placed inside of a logistics facility or stored in a warehouse, and now you've got a Indian meal moth problem or various weevil problems that can contaminate further other foodstuffs or products. And so I think those are probably some of the biggest. We do some amount on the vertebrate side too with birds getting into facilities, but they're not readily, moved through the transport train. They come into facilities through doors and openings and things like that.
Well, that makes sense. And we're about, of course, to enter the summer months. Is there some seasonality among the types of pests that are
getting into facilities? Is this a time when more insects, for instance, are prevalent in a facility during the summer months? Is winter more of a problem time for rodents looking for a warm environment? What's the seasonality like for these critters?
Yeah, it can definitely vary a little bit by seasonality. With the summer months, most insects are ectotherms. They require, temperature and humidity to be at the levels that support their life cycles. And so we definitely see in the summer months more and more insect pests. That also speeds up their development time. And so we can see turnover in their population cycles more readily. Um, that can also mean things like a stored product pest that maybe is in spillage inside of a trailer can survive in ambient temperature, whereas through the winter months, maybe they wouldn't, right, if they're in a trailer. But now we can potentially move stuff around through different facilities. So insects are always going to be more prevalent in the summer months. On the rodent side, it varies a little bit. Those three species I mentioned, the commensal rodents, one of the ways they've taken advantage of being around humans is they essentially breed all throughout the year. So they don't have maybe as much direct temperature or season. It's more tied to how materials are being shipped and stored. And so I like to pick on grass seed as an example. Grass seed that sits maybe outside through the winter months is a great place for a mouse to set up shop. And that grass seed that's been sitting outside now is getting shipped into a facility and has been out, for the spring and potentially getting moved again over the summer to be out for the fall to get seeds out. And that can be a great place for rodents to get introduced into an area, and then they just thrive really all times of year.
You mentioned about some of the ways that they're transported or some of the food products that they eat, but what damages can insects and rodents actually cause in our facility if left untreated?
Yeah. Um, with it, it comes down a lot to the products themselves. Any kind of food-based product, pharmaceutical, or even animal feed, there are regulations at the federal level here in the U.S. to ensure that they're not spoiled, they're not contaminated. Sometimes the insects or rodents will simply just eat and contaminate materials that way. But oftentimes they can also bring other pathogens in. And some of those may be a fungus on a weevil that just starts to break down a grain product, right? So it spoils the grain product that they got into, a bag of oatmeal or what have you. So then it just becomes unfit for consumption. Whereas we have potentially more serious concerns with things like rodents that can spread leptospirosis in their urine and feces, and simply by being in unclean areas, pick up, salmonella or E. coli on their bodies and can transfer that through food products. And so that's why it's a big concern if they get into a facility and start to get in and amongst a lot of these products. From a structural side, there's a little bit of a concern too with rodents, just because they chew on all kinds of different things. And so when they're looking for places to nest and things to chew on, they can get into wiring and HVAC systems and cause other concerns, just by being inside of a structure, or maybe they get in the drop ceiling in an office space. And all of these pests can also create an area that employees don't want to deal with, right? They all of a sudden figure out, well, I'm a forklift driver and I got to go pick product, but I don't want to go down aisle 14 because I know that there's rats down there, or I don't want to go deal with moving this pallet because last time I did, moths flew all over the place, and it just becomes an issue that way. So it can damage product directly. It can impact the facility. It can also impact the employees in a facility too. And so keeping everybody safe and happy is always one of the goals that I know everybody shares. And so that's certainly something that we look to try and help manage.
Well, that makes sense. Of course, many of these pests can multiply very quickly. I was surprised to find out just how quickly some of them can multiply. Why is this a problem, and why is ignoring it and hoping they just go away not really a good strategy?
Yeah, I like to tell a lot of folks that resources drive reproduction with most of the pests that we deal with. And inside of a lot of warehousing facilities, we have put everything that they would ever want within an arm's reach. And so it's temperature controlled to some extent. They've got food resources readily available. And a lot of times, a lot of these species don't even need a ready water source, especially when we're dealing with things like mice. And so ignoring it or hoping it's going to go away is only going to lead to a much larger issue in the very near future. Things like mice, they're having litters every 3 weeks once they're sexually mature, and it only takes them really 4 to 5 weeks before they become that. So just a handful of mice, for instance, can become potentially several hundred when they've got all the resources they could ever want inside of a facility. And so the same thing happens on a much larger scale when we deal with a lot of the insects. And that's super important to understand that if you start to have issues, it's something that needs to be managed. Nobody wants to deal with it, but that's why pest control exists as an industry.
So what are some simple things that managers can do to prevent pests from entering and setting up home in our facilities?
That's a really great question, and that's one of the things that we often focus on is really just the education aspect to make sure that if you're managing a warehouse or a facility or a part of the logistic chain, that you're taking an active role in not causing other issues. And so a lot of times understanding, do you have or need an inspection process when you're bringing in all of your products, certain products? If something does have an issue with it, what is the protocol to deal with it, right? If it's coming off of a trailer at the bay door and you understand it's got mice in it, it needs to go back on the trailer, that's secured and moved away from the building until that can be dealt with. Or you need a specific quarantine area. Another big thing that we see is having that access to resources. So if we're talking about stored food products, for example, a lot of times they're packaged, but as things get moved around in a warehouse, they can often get damaged and you get spillage. So what's the sanitation effort inside of a facility? While it may not be super obvious, if you've got a bunch of spillage underneath racking or inside of a warehouse, and there's no process to clean that, you're just allowing for a really great food resource to exist. And all it takes is that introduction. And then once they're in, they've got everything that they need readily available. So having a really good sanitation process is a really key component to managing pests, without even talking about any kind of chemicals or monitoring or anything like that. It's just making sure the area is clean. And then it's very unlikely that things are going to be able to set up shop. And then kind of the last thing I'll say is really looking at facility maintenance as a whole. And while you don't really think about this, maybe in very large warehouses, there's a leak, that's not damaging any product. It's in a contained area. We'll deal with it eventually. But that's an opening where, again, water, one of the key resources, and potential actual pests can get in. And so any kind of openings that allow things like water or even larger openings that would allow pests themselves to enter should be addressed sooner rather than later to make sure that it's, again, unlikely that anything ever gets in. But education amongst all of the employees and making sure everybody is aware of both the impact of all of these things I just mentioned, but also if there is a pest that actually gets cited, how does the reporting go? How do I alert somebody so that, again, this issue gets caught very early on? It's always more manageable the sooner it gets addressed versus letting it grow kind of in the shadows.
In looking at this, I was surprised to find that a lot of them come in where utility lines enter the facility, and also that a mouse can get into a size smaller than a dime and a rat smaller than a quarter.
Yeah.
It seems like there'd be a lot of ample opportunity of tiny holes in a facility where they could enter.
Absolutely. And that's one of the things that we often look at is, especially with our rodents, but most of your vertebrates, if they can get their head through an opening, and they look bigger than they are with their fur, right? If they can get their head through, the rest of the body will almost always follow. And so when we think about mice, very small, they really just got to be able to get their head into an opening underneath a door that doesn't quite seal well, like you mentioned, around electrical or conduit lines that are coming through a wall that isn't sealed properly. So taking that really specific inspection and mindset of if I was a mouse, where could I get in? And a lot of people don't think like that, which is understandable, right? Why would you? But taking that opportunity to say, where are these access points, and then what can we do to address them? You know, there are specialized door sweeps that can be installed to not only secure a bay door, but to prevent rodents from chewing through it. There's different types of materials that can be used to successfully stop rodents from chewing in and around utility line openings. So having some specialized knowledge to be able to inspect a property, and also knowing what materials would be best to ensure that you don't have continuing issues is very important to ultimately manage that problem, and is very proactive to make sure that it doesn't become a large issue in the future.
You mentioned about inspecting products as they come into the facility to make sure that they aren't infested with rodents or insects.
Mm-hmm.
How can we also avoid exporting our pests to other facilities by securing our shipments? We certainly don't want to send those to our customers.
Yeah, having a good monitoring system in place is always good to understand. Do I have an issue to begin with, right? Whether you're taking entire pallets or breaking pallets down and taking parts and pieces of them, understanding what is getting pulled from the floor, how that's getting packaged, and taking the time to educate the folks that are doing that to look at, hey, this bag of dog food has a little hole in it. That's strange. Could that mean that a mouse has gotten into it or a rodent's got into it? And what do I do with that then, right? Again, that goes back to the training and having a robust reporting process to ensure that when somebody sees something, there's action that gets attached to it. And that also is a really great way to start to understand very quickly and justify, right? Hey, somebody just talked to us about sealing up all these doors and it's going to cost, $20,000. Well, if you start to see, well, we've just lost $30,000 worth of product last month because we had all these issues, it starts to justify itself. And that's one of the things we always encourage folks is to really look at kind of the hidden costs that go into some of this pest damage. You mentioned if we ship something, who's going to be responsible to that if the next facility or the end user gets a bag of dog food with a mouse in it. So understanding and taking ownership of what's within a facility and having processes in place to ensure that the quality of the products are maintained throughout is super important.
We've been talking to Ian Williams. He's a manager in the entomology department at pest control company Orkin. Thank you again, Ian. It's been a pleasure having you with us.
David, thanks so much.
Now let's take a look at some of the other supply chain news from the week. And Victoria, this past week has been another whirlwind week for the on again, off again, back on again tariffs. And you wrote this week about another group chiming in, and that's the global exporters who are sharing their outlook on the current trade situation. What are they saying?
Yeah, that's right, Dave. So globally, nearly 60% of companies expect a negative impact from the Trump administration's Liberation Day tariff rollout, which happened back on April 2nd. Seems like a long time ago, but really not so long, really. That's according to a survey of 4,500 companies from around the world, including the United States. And it was conducted in March and April by the international credit insurer Allianz Trade. The Allianz Trade Global Survey 2025 also found that the unpredictability of U.S. trade policy is dampening exporters' confidence, with 42% of respondents saying they expect their firm's annual income to decline between 2% and 10% over the next 12 months. Now, that's compared to fewer than 5% who said so before the April 2nd trade announcements. The size of this survey is what really struck me. As I said, 4,500 companies were polled just before and just after the April 2nd tariff rollout. And I think it underscores the uncertainty that we've been talking with supply chain professionals about here on the podcast and in the magazine's pages these past several weeks.
Victoria, did the report indicate any insights on what companies are doing to deal with the situation?
Yes, and it was interesting. The author said companies are relying on coping mechanisms to navigate the ups and downs. Those mechanisms include passing on higher costs, diversification, and looking for alternative shipping routes. The report also found that U.S. firms in particular are decoupling from China and reshoring to Western Europe and Latin America. And they say that should continue despite the short-term U.S.-China tariff reprieve that was announced earlier this month.
Well, that's probably wise, seeing that among the targeted nations, China is probably the one nation that is most in the bullseye of these tariffs and could be subject to the highest tariffs once all the dust finally settles, whenever that will be.
That's right. Yeah.
Thank you, Victoria.
You're welcome.
And Ben, we've been following attempts by California to eventually do away with internal combustion forklifts, including those that are propane powered. And this week, a new development was announced. Can you explain more?
Yeah, glad to. So this follows up a little bit on the theme of how businesses have had to cope with uncertainty. Fortunately, in this case, there is a little bit more reliability now. That's because it has to do with one of the very important aspects of logistics and warehousing, which is forklifts. The news ended a long debate about whether propane-fueled forklifts could operate in warehouses in the state of California, and it had been caught up in a lawsuit. To cut to the chase, propane forklifts will be allowed. This started when the California Air Resources Board, also known as CARB commonly, created a policy called the zero-emission forklift rule, which was intended to help the state meet its air quality and climate goals. Not too surprisingly, the Western Propane Gas Association industry group disagreed with the policy. They argued that the rule failed to consider the environmental impacts of things like the new infrastructure construction to meet the mandate, increased use of diesel generators to make the electricity to charge battery-powered forklifts instead, new energy peak demands and different emissions from that. But whoever was right about the debate, the state figured that it couldn't move ahead with its rule anyway without approval from the United States Environmental Protection Agency, the EPA, since California's regulation would be different from the national standard, so they need an allowance for that.
Well, you mentioned some very important issues within that debate. How did they actually resolve the argument?
Well, it looks like basically California saw the writing on the wall when the Trump administration began, and the state assumed that it would most likely not get that EPA approval under the current administration. So they settled the case in court before it went to trial. And that actually marks a similar strategy that CARB had followed earlier this year, when it likewise abandoned campaigns that would have required truck fleets and also railroad locomotives to use zero-emission vehicles within the state. So now with the forklift situation, the rule would have meant that fleets had to phase in zero-emission or battery-powered forklifts between 2028 and 2038. It also would have curtailed the sale of internal combustion engine forklifts sooner than that. But now CARB says that for the duration of the current federal administration, it will not enforce that zero-emission forklift regulation that still lingers on the books in the state. And they actually went even a little further. CARB and the Western Propane Gas Association have agreed to work together on any future forklift rulemakings. And in fact, CARB will name a liaison, a deputy executive officer, they're called, to be a liaison to the forklift industry and their stakeholders. So this is clearly a win for the propane industry, also for logistics and warehouse operators, just because now there's a little bit less uncertainty and they can move forward. I might point out that the industry often argues that propane forklifts run a lot cleaner than gas-fired forklifts anyway. But whatever you think about all these issues, maybe the most important thing for the logistics sector is that this decision at least gives some better clarity that warehouses can plan around for the next few years.
Right. It does provide some of those answers and certainty for operators in planning their forklift fleets, but it also gives users more opportunity to select the types of vehicles that can benefit them the most.
Both good points. Yep.
Thank you, Ben.
Glad to.
We encourage listeners to go to dcvelocity.com for more on these and other supply chain stories. Also, check out the podcast notes section for some direct links to read more about the topics that we discussed today. And we'd like to thank Ian Williams of Orkin for being our guest. We welcome your comments on this topic and our other stories. You can email us at podcast@agilebme.com. We also encourage you to subscribe to Logistics Matters at your favorite podcast platform. Our new episodes are uploaded on Fridays. And a reminder that Logistics Matters is sponsored by Storage Solutions. Storage Solutions, a Young Heinrich company, is a leading intralogistics integrator, helping companies design scalable, tailored solutions. From warehouse consultations to racking and automation solutions, they deliver proven, reliable technologies built to support your operations now and scale with you as you grow. To learn more, visit storage-solutions.com. We'll be back again next week with another edition of Logistics Matters. Be sure to join us. Until then, have a great week.